So now we'll go ahead and get started here on the American Empire, the United States expanding out um, towards the South and especially into the Caribbean. So what we have in the United States is the expansion westward brings a lot of prosperity to the United States. You have a lot of natural resources that are needed to power these new industrial cities um, that are being formed in the United States, and then also you need uh, a lot of these natural resources to trade with European powers that are looking for natural resources in the United States as they move forward or westward, excuse me, as they move westward, they find that what they thought was the great American desert is in fact a very lush breadbasket of the country, and they have a lot of natural resources available for them. And so you start seeing this westward movement, especially with the rise of the railroad and the rise of mass transportation. You start seeing more people moving westward, and the natural resources play a big part um, in that movement west. However, this movement westward comes at a price for the people that are already there. Native American land is gradually taken by the Americans moving westward, the settlers in the West, and as the natives fight back, they are constantly defeated by the um, superior firepower of the American army. And you can see here the great painting of Columbia moving westward. You can see her coming in from the east, moving westward, bringing in light into the darkness, and the herds of buffalo, the natives there. The wild animals are all shrouded in darkness, and it is the railroad and the stagecoach, the farmers and miners that are pushing America forward, that they are the ones that are really making this country what it is. And so everything dark, everything that is uncivilized is being pushed out. The other thing that you have in the United States at this time that really helps its prosperity is the rise of cities. You have here in 1860, the five biggest cities in America, the first one being New York, the second one being Philadelphia, then Brooklyn, followed by Baltimore and Boston. So you can see here that New York is by far the biggest city in the United States, and it will be, um, you know, uh, for here on out. But New York proper with 813,000 people, and the next biggest city is Philadelphia at 565, and then you have Brooklyn, Boston, and Baltimore. So all of the population in 1860 before the Civil War is located in on the East Coast, not very far from where the population has been since 1600. And so because of the lack of mass transportation, mass um, ability to move mass products throughout the country, you have very little migration away from your home. So these population centers are either close to rivers or close to ports, and very rarely are they um, away from the East Coast. So you could see some population centers there. A lot of the population centers in the West are going to be from Mexican citizens, French citizens down in Louisiana, and Mormon settlers here in near the Great Salt Lake. And so this is 1860. Now, in 1860, the biggest city furthest west is Chicago at 100,000 people. So you do have a large city going towards the west. However, um, you have this sort of stop here at Chicago because there's no way to really get out west, and that all changes by 1900. So within um, Within this time frame here in 1900, you get this big movement. New York gains, because of migration, gains millions of new citizens. So it goes from 800,000 to 3.3 million. Chicago booms during this time period between 1860 and 1900. You get a huge um, huge uptick in people living in Chicago from 100,000 to 1.6 million. So it becomes the second biggest city in the country, followed by Philadelphia, which also booms, and then surprisingly St. Louis on the or on the Mississippi River, becomes this great movement, or this great place of movement westward, because it is a port city, because it does connect all the rivers to the Mississippi, and it has a readily available port for ships to come in from the east and go out west. You can come in from the coast, from New York, and take a boat all the way through to St. Louis, and then go all the way up through into Minnesota, into Montana, all the way up into Washington, just using river paths. You could also even go into Texas, New Mexico, and all these different places using mainly rivers. So St. Louis, by steamboat and by rail, becomes the gateway to the West. And Boston is the fifth biggest city in the United States at this point, with 560,000. So you're starting to see these populations boom. Immigration from Europe increases. You have um, a lot of new migrants coming in from Mexico and Canada, et cetera, et cetera. So this is really the beginning of the movement westward. And so this movement westward, um, you can see here some of the cities that begin to rise in the West are cities like Denver, Los Angeles, uh, uh, San Diego, and then Portland and Seattle. So you start seeing the West. The West is beginning to grow its own cities, and you have, even in the South after the Civil War, the rise of big cities. So you have things like Nashville, Tennessee. You have the Triangle in North Carolina, Greensboro, Raleigh, and Durham. You have Atlanta, Georgia, and Louisiana, of course, and then so you have bigger cities beginning to rise, and immigration beginning to be very important in cities. So you have immigration from Europe really helps the East Coast. Immigrants from Italy and Germany um, and uh, uh, Eastern Europe and Ireland. So these, especially towards the 1900 itself, you have a lot more people coming in. You also have on the West Coast, you have the immigration from Asia as the Ming, uh, as the Qing are defeated, and the Manchu are forced to leave China. They settle into areas such as Los Angeles and San Francisco and um, Portland and Washington, and begin to work on the railroads there. So the people that were in charge of China were the ones that were able to have enough money to come and move over to the United States. But when it got here, they found themselves forced into manual labor, as opposed to being able to set up professional. Being professionals in their vocations. You also, as I said, you have immigration in and out of Mexico, especially after, especially the beginnings of the 20th century, the border is very, very fluid in the United States, in the Southwest United States. It's not up until the 1950s, 1960s, that you actually have this idea that the border needs to be patrolled and it needs to be closed up. Migrant workers come in. Uh, Migrant workers come in very readily during the harvest season, and then they go back to Mexico. So there's a very the border really doesn't mean anything from, for about 100 years, from the end of the U.S. Mexican War and into the 1950s. So it is there's a lot of immigration coming in, and eventually there's a lot of Mexican immigrants settling into areas like Arizona, and Texas and New Mexico. You also have the dreaded plague of Canadians coming in very politely, and setting up in the northern regions of the United States, just like the southwestern border. The northern border is very fluid, and even to this day, it's still pretty fluid and doesn't, people come in and out, or they used to, until we're no longer welcome in Canada. And they used to come in and out a lot more freely, and it's pretty easy to go up through the northern border than it is the southern border. But for hundreds of years, for about over 100 years, 150 years, this border was very, very loose. And this is a big change from when Canada and was always weary of the United States possibly invading. And then, of course, you have migration east to west. So this is why these city centers are growing in populations, because people are moving from cities out east and going into the west. And then you also have interstate and international, or excuse me, interstate and interborder movements from small cities into big cities. Farmers that had worked out in Nebraska, Kansas, their children got tired of living that life and moved into big cities such as Chicago and St. Louis, Missouri, so that you have movement from small towns into big towns. And then in the South, after the Civil War, you have movements of former slaves from rural farms into bigger cities, trying to escape the rural lifestyle. And then you have the movement of former slaves up north once they continue to find discrimination, and in the era of Jim Crow, especially, you see them moving up to New York, and Pennsylvania, Detroit, and Chicago, and St. Louis as well. So, like I said, immigration from Europe is key for East Coast cities, but you have issues of assimilation with immigrants from not only Europe but also from other places, Mexico, Asian immigrants, and especially Eastern European immigrants. It takes a while for them to even come close to assimilating. Immigrants create this new labor force, which angers nativists that are working hard. There's that idea of they're taking our jobs, and this is because they're willing to work for pennies on the dollar, and so you have a lot of riots, a lot of violence against natives during this time. This is, however, a time of reform also. As the United States prospers, you also have progressive movements that work for better pay and conditions for workers. Nativists tend to attack immigrants for their ideas, for the idea that they are, taking jobs away from Americans, while in others are going to work hard for these new workers to get better pay. And so you're going to see the rise of unions that are trying to not only help themselves, but also help the the new workers, and this isn't always the case. Union has a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, a lot of anti-immigration settlement, and this is one of the things about labor that is a controversial issue, as the fact that labor unions have routinely been very anti-immigrant, and it worked. It took a while for the for immigrants to be able to get into skilled trade unions, as opposed to just regular labor unions that were more for unskilled laborers. And so the governments really begin to step in and regulate industry to a certain degree. You see the regulation of work hours, the regulation of the amount that you could pay people, the beginnings of minimum wage, etc. So this U.S. prosperity, it eventually leads to reform, and eventually leads to a change in the way that we see immigration, but it is a very slow change. And here is a picture of Standard Oil and the way that people used to look at corporations, and the way that they or large conglomerates, and the way that they would um, basically have their tendrils and everything, and how they would be um, crushing the United States um, under their many tentacles here. So once you have a prosperous United States, you begin to see expansion into the Caribbean. The Monroe Doctrine, which was the idea that European forces won't interfere in the Americas. It gains a Roosevelt corollary. We'll talk more about Teddy Roosevelt in a bit. But basically, there are what Teddy Roosevelt eventually ends up saying is that you can have preemptive strikes for freedom. And so the U.S. begins to meddle in Latin American affairs, and this is going to be going on throughout the 20th century, especially into the Cold War era, even up until the 1990s, and in some cases up until today. Um, but basically, in order to guarantee freedom, and by freedom, it usually means freedom for American companies to do business in Latin America. The U.S. will, if need be, uh, um, go into the Caribbean and stamp out any forces. And because of this, the um, Caribbean becomes a battleground. The Spanish-American War begins with the sinking of the Maine. A U.S. ship is explodes in the Caribbean, and the Spanish are blamed for it. And this is a very short war in uh, two theaters. You have the Caribbean theater, and then you also have the theater in the Philippines, in Eastern Asia. After the war, the Philippines become a part of the United States, but also Cuba and Puerto Rico come under U.S. control. Puerto Rico remains under U.S. control, but Cuba eventually becomes its independent country. This leads to the creation of Guantanamo Bay naval base, and naval base that is on Cuban soil, but it is rented to the United States, so it sort of is in this legal limbo. And basically, after this, the Caribbean is known as the Panama Lake, or excuse me, Caribbean is known as America's Lake, because you also have things like the Panama Canal that begins as a French project in 1881, but then the United States basically takes it over, and as of 1904 controls it. So the Spanish-American War leads to the rise of Roosevelt and the rise of this new ability to have preemptive strikes for American freedom, or for Western freedom. And even though you have the expansion into the Caribbean, the United States also expands into Asia. You have the Spanish American War, like I said, had that second theater that was in the Philippines. The Filipinos are in revolt against the Spanish, or against the Spanish leaders, and so the Americans are going to play into this by backing the Filipinos, and then the Filipinos are going to say we won, and then the United States will say, well, now you're under our control, and the Filipinos will fight back, and the United States will put this down with impunity. Mass graves, mass executions of men, women, and children will follow. The this What the Americans see as a rebellion by the Filipinos, and so the Philippines will be under control, under American control for a great part of the 20th century. Um, the U.S. then will begin to meddle into the affairs of China in 1898. You also begin to see the opening up of China, and the U.S. is going to propose an open door policy. Equal trading among all the Western powers: the Italians, the French, the British, and Austrians, Prussians would all trade equally in the East, from India through into the East Indies, and basically Europe ignores the United States. The United States doesn't have the clout that it needs to tell the European forces what to do, and so the European forces instead are going to continue this march into the East and creating their zones of influence, creating colonies, creating a lot of bad blood in the East, that will eventually come back to bite them. But the United States also becomes this world power. It has it has become just another Western imperialist power pretty quickly too. If you can imagine, from 1776 to 1900, in those 125 years, exactly where the United States has gone from a colony of Britain into now its own imperial power, and as it moves quickly, the United States expands quickly, and expands into other areas such as Asia and the Caribbean, quickly, and the quickness of this change and moving into a world power is only matched by the next people we're going to be looking at, the imperial power of Japan.